soon as populations converted over to agricultural crop-based nutrition, the height and health of the populations declined. And that happened everywhere and every when on every continent at every time that happened, including the last 150 years with the Native Americans, Native Australians, Native Alaskans, Native Canadians, etc., who were largely carnivores, if not completely carnivores, especially when you're an Inuit living up in the North Pole.
Hey guys, thank you so much for supporting us and watching our videos. If you'd like to support us some more and get some of our merchandise like this awesome apron, be sure to check out our website at thecarnivorevolution.com. Hey everybody, welcome to the Carnivore Revolution. I'm Serena, and today we have a returning guest. We have Dr. Anthony Chaffee with us. He is a former all-star American rugby player who is living in Australia and is a doctor now. And so we want to talk to him about his story, why he doesn't eat plants, and why we probably shouldn't either. Dr. Chaffee, thank you so much for being here.
Not a problem. Thank you for having me.
So I'm excited to just kind of go down this rabbit hole with you. People tend to really believe things more coming from a doctor, right? And so I want to get into all of that and talk about all of that. But let's start with your story and how you started eating like only animal products.
Well, it was sort of by default when I was in my undergraduate degree 24 years ago, and I had taken botany and biology. I understood that plants use toxins to defend themselves because they're stationary; they can't run away or fight back like animals can. And so I understood that, and I understood that most plants were inedible for that reason. But then no one ever went into the fact that the ones that are so-called edible still have these toxins, and those can affect us negatively. Until I had a professor of cancer biology who actually made that point very clear. And he showed us that just the fruits and vegetables that we eat, grains, legumes, beans, seeds, nuts, everything that we would eat on a typical basis, that these all had defense chemicals as well. These were all toxic to a certain degree, and they actually could cause harm. And as this was a cancer biology class, we were looking at this in the context of cancer. And so he was actually telling us that Brussels sprouts had over 136 known carcinogens at the time, 24 years ago. So they're figured out more at this point. Mushrooms had over 100, but all the other produce items had over 60, 80, even over 100. And he impressed upon us that he didn't eat vegetables, he didn't eat salad, he wouldn't let his kids eat vegetables because, in his words, plants are trying to kill you. And it just that was like just the hammer drop. And I just said, right, I'm never eating plants again. And I was like, okay, well, what do I eat? And so I just defaulted into eating eggs and meat because they didn't come from plants. That was my only criteria, was don't be a plant, don't mushroom. Yeah. And so that was it. And so I just ate eggs and meat, and I felt absolutely amazing. I was playing, I was an All-American rugby player. I was playing in university level and at the senior men's level in the US and Canada and the Canadian Premiership. And I felt amazing. And I never felt or played better in my life. And then I sort of slipped off of this in my mid-20s when I was playing professionally in England. And I didn't know what was going on. 2 months earlier, I felt like a superhero, and now I'm not feeling very good. Why don't I feel as good as I normally do? And I couldn't figure it out because I was still working out the same. I didn't drink during the rugby season. And I just thought, okay, well, maybe I've just hit that age, just, 25 and a half, and that's it. It's just downhill from here. And I couldn't figure out what it was until 13 years later. I'm 38 years old. And I came across information that said, well, no, actually, just humans are carnivores as a species. And that's how I was living. I was living as a carnivore, eating as a carnivore. And that was a time period I've never felt better in my entire life. And when I started feeling a bit worse and thinking, like, why don't I feel as great anymore? That's when I started incorporating in little things like crumbed chicken, because it was just convenient. It was easy just to buy a whole pack of pre-cooked chicken that has some crumbs on it. And that was easy for me when I was, doing 2-a-days and training all the time. And it's just grab some chicken. And I said the same thing that people say now. Well, yes, there's poison, but dose makes the poisons. But it's a throwaway line because the only rational follow up to that is, and the dose is, because if you don't say what the dose is, then it's a meaningless statement. And also there are plants make about 1 million different defense chemicals. What's the dose on each one of them? And so each plant has hundreds or even thousands of these defense chemicals. And so you say, oh, dose makes a poison. Oh, okay. I guess it's not poison then.
Yeah.
Here's some arsenic. Yeah, dose makes the poison. Yeah, have as much as you want there. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just a very strange thing to say, and it's not rational. But I said it to myself. I said, well, dose makes the poison. Maybe it's not all that bad, just a bit of crumbs, but it actually made a huge difference. And I didn't put two and two together until later. And because I let something slip in, other things slipped in. I never ate a processed food diet. I never ate a standard American diet. I always ate a very, very clean, whole food, omnivorous diet that was heavily meat based, but lean meat, because that was just the flavor of the day was lean. And then at that point, when I was 38, and I just realized, well, no, humans are carnivores. I was living as a carnivore, and all animals do best on their biologically appropriate diet. That's why there's signs at the zoo and at parks that say don't feed the animals because it makes them very sick when they eat something they're not designed to eat. And we're animals, and we need to recognize that those same laws apply to us. And so I just said, right, I knew it. I knew plants were trying to kill me, get rid of these stupid things. I was just eating vegetables and meat at the time, and I just cut out the vegetables, started eating a lot more and much fattier meat, and absolutely night and day difference. I felt absolutely amazing. I felt like I was 22 again, carnivore, and I decided to go back out and play rugby, and I felt great doing it. So since then, I looked deeply into the literature and said, okay, what do we know? What can we prove? What do we still need to find out? And I found that there's copious amounts of evidence, physiological evidence, anthropological evidence, evolutionary biological evidence, paleoanthropological evidence, and anatomical evidence, biological, biochemical, and even randomized controlled human trials in animal-based ketogenic diets. There's thousands of studies, like the ketogenic diet, but the ketogenic diet is you cut out carbohydrates. What do you replace it with? Fat and protein. Where
Right.
does fat and protein come from? Largely meat. And the studies that show significant benefit in specific health outcomes, they use animal-based
Mhm.
ketogenic diets. In fact, the ones that use things like Crisco and other things to get animals in ketosis, those are the ones that are saying like, oh, maybe there's a problem with a ketogenic diet. Like, no, there's a problem with Crisco.
That's right.
Uh, Being in ketosis is not the problem.
Yeah.
And so there are actually thousands of studies on heavily animal-based, high-fat, animal fat diets, the ketogenic diets. A carnivore diet is an animal-based ketogenic diet. So actually, there's quite a lot of evidence out there, and so I started looking at this and applying it to myself, applying it to my patients, and I started seeing absolutely remarkable recoveries, and I started seeing people reversing diseases that just are simply thought to be irreversible, and we just
Mhm.
don't know the cause, and so there's no possible way to cure it. Well, we know the cause now. It's the food.
Right.
We're
Mhm.
poisoning ourselves from the food. Diabetes, autoimmune diseases, even many cancers or heart disease, dementia, these sorts of things. These are all things that we're getting in a much higher prevalence now that we almost never used to get before. Animals get them, but only when being fed an inappropriate diet. And we feed them human food, and zookeepers will tell you, or vets will tell you, they'll get human diseases. Okay, so
Mhm.
human diseases are these chronic diseases that we're plagued with, but it's only when you give them the food that we're eating. So maybe we should think about why we're eating that food at the same time.
Yeah. So what do you think about, because I hear this all the time, and I'm sure you do too. People say, oh, but vegetables are biblical. We should be eating vegetables. How could you say vegetables aren't good? We should eat the rainbow. Do you think that vegetables are different now than they were then? I mean, don't you think that nothing is really natural
No,
anymore, right?
nothing. No, I mean, we don't even have the same the plants that we cultivate, fruits and vegetables that we use. I mean, these things are largely not the hereditary crops that we had thousands of years ago when we first started agriculture. But even then, with the advent of agriculture, there is a clear line in the fossil record, pre and post agriculture, where people drop by an average of 5 inches for adult male height, brain size reduced by 11% for men, 17% for women, and shorter femurs, which is a mark of poor nutrition during development, or wound healing, signs of tuberculosis in the spinal column for the first time. And we're only seeing this post agriculture. And it wasn't hundreds of years or thousands of years, it was overnight. As soon as populations converted over to agricultural crop based nutrition, the height and health of the populations declined. And that happened everywhere and every when on every continent at every time that happened. including the last 150 years with the Native Americans, Native Australians, Native Alaskans, Native Canadians, etc., who were largely carnivores, if not completely carnivores, especially when you're, the Inuit living up in the North Pole and then you're on an ice floe and they're not growing anything on ice. And then you start getting them into eating more Western agricultural based foods, crop based foods, and they start getting the same exact illnesses and diseases. And this is what anthropologists call a transition in the health effects, afflictions of these populations. You have primitive populations, the health afflictions that affect them are injury and infectious disease. And they actually typically live as long or longer than Western populations, just so long as they don't get killed as a child or something like that. But when they die of old age, they're living just as long, if not longer. So they have plenty of time to manifest these afflictions if they were just genetic and these just happen to people. Certainly if they happen from meat, because they're largely eating meat when they can get it. And so there's this turning point where it goes from infectious disease and injury to then getting the so-called diseases of civilization, which are called human diseases in the veterinary zoological world. It used to be called Western diseases, and now are just called non-communicable chronic diseases. So cardiovascular disease, COPD, cancer, autoimmunity, mental health issues, diabetes, these sorts of things. And so, that's a very, very clear distinction. So we saw this 10,000 years ago. We saw this 100 years ago. It happens every single time. And yes, you're right. The plants that we're eating now are very different than the ones that we were eating long ago. The soil is very different because we have this widespread crop agriculture that is basically mining minerals and nutrients out of the soil. And if you don't have animals grazing around, eating some of this down, defecating, urinating to replenish these nutrients in the soil, they go away. And that's why they use, animal manure, but also petrochemicals to try to get these nutrients down back in the soil. But, there have been studies that show that spinach now has less than a third of the micronutrients that spinach in the 1950s had. So even just the soil health is very different because of crop agriculture. And crop agriculture destroys the land. This is what caused the Dust Bowl in America in the early 1900s, because we were just tilling up and churning up all this topsoil. The wind was taking it off. Rain was coming down, washing it away, and they just till it up again because it's about 20 feet thick of topsoil, because extremely, extremely fertile land, and because of all the animals. And eventually we burned through it all, and we got down to just hard dirt. We lost all the topsoil, and the middle of America was turning into a Sahara desert. And they figured that out. They figured that it was because of our crop management, and they changed that around so it prevented a disaster. But it's still causing problems. It's still mining these minerals out, and we're still losing topsoil. We're still losing 27.5 billion tons of topsoil every year, which is an area the size of Kentucky every single year. And if you realize that topsoil takes 500 years to grow half an inch, you realize this is a scarce resource that will run out. And so, if you want to sort of, eating the rainbow is very funny. When what vitamin is purple? And it's just like, oh, I'm feeling a little low on orange today, so I need to go have something. Or like, oh, I think I may need some blue or yellow. I mean, what a silly thing to say. There are plenty of different phytochemicals that will manifest and display different colors. And so you just be like, oh, it has blue, I need more blue. I have more purple, I need more purple. It's nonsense. And so, I mean, just eat a pack of Skittles then, I guess, if all you need it's colors, It's so that's always just absurd on its face. But the eating biblically, there are plenty of biblical accounts of how the importance of eating meat and the fatted calf, the fatted lamb, and things like that, how important it was to eat meat and eat fat. In fact, in most religious texts, it's very, very important to eat. Even in the Hindu religion and the Ayurvedic texts, the original ones, it was very clear. When you have guests come in, you have an important ceremony, something like that, you sacrifice a bull and you have this fatted calf and you eat meat. It was very important. That switched about 900 years ago. And they started saying, no, we're all vegetarians now because we're all good and pure and wonderful. But the original texts were all about how important it
Mhm.
was to eat cow, actually.
Mhm.
And so, and then if you want to go really far back in the Bible, it says, there's the story of Cain and Abel,
Mhm.
right? So Cain was a farmer and Abel was a herder, and Abel sacrificed, meat to God, and God was pleased. And then Cain sacrificed his plants to God, and God was displeased. And you mentioned that to some people. Well, that's because Cain's heart wasn't pure, and the sacrifice. It doesn't say that in the Bible. It doesn't say anything like that in the Bible. It says God liked the meat, didn't like the plants. That's all it says. It says God was displeased. And so Cain got upset, killed Abel, which is like the first historical documented sort of vegan rage. Smashed his brain and killed him, and then his his children progeny ended up just plaguing the land and terrorizing everything until God finally said, "Yep, enough of this," and sent a flood and wiped it out, and then had Noah save animals, and then at the end of it, he said, "Now you eat those animals. None of this vegetarian bullshit anymore. Just eat the animals." And that was actually a commandment from God that you will
Mhm.
eat animals now. And so it's if you really want to get picky about it, there are some clear stories in the Bible that probably should avoid plants, that they're not the best for us, and then we should eat meat. God said so.
Yeah. And the idea that our ancestors, like way, way back, were vegetarians is absurd to me. And I know it is to you too. The very idea of it is just crazy because when they were foraging for food, people just like, I think people think that there was just always a grocery store on every corner, right? Like, or people always had gardens growing. We didn't always have gardens growing either. We didn't know how to do that. So, and we didn't have all of the fruits and vegetables that we have now. We had minute, a tiny, tiny fraction of what we have now as far as fruits and vegetables go. So you might find a handful of blueberries for everybody, in your family, or, one or two little things along the way as you're, traveling throughout the day, but you couldn't find enough vegetables and fruits to create a whole meal. And so the idea of that, I don't know where that comes from or why people even for a second think that could possibly be true. They were taking down large game to survive. They were fasting most of the time when they didn't have a large game, and maybe the delicacy or the treat of happening to come across some fruits and vegetables for the day.
Well, and also fruits and vegetables, fruits in particular, were not available throughout
Right.
the year. It was seasonal, local. It
Mhm.
was 2 weeks out of the year they were available. And what about during the ice ages?
Right.
The fossil record is very clear. When the ice shelves came down, humans went up into the ice. They didn't run away towards the equator where the fruit was. And that's something that when people saying that, oh, humans were herbivores and things like that. I mean, it's just completely made up. I mean, that has never ever been something posited by any
Mhm.
archaeologist, paleontologist, or anybody looking at the fossil record. That's always been very, very. I mean, I learned that in second grade, that humans
Yeah.
have been apex predators as long as humans have been humans. And there's very clear evidence that we've been hunting large game mammoths, scaring them off cliffs and things like that. There's just copious records in the fossil
Mhm.
record showing that, stone tools, butcher marks down bones that can only have come from stone tools. They even match the sediment, the different sorts of minerals and materials that were deposited in the bone, and match those to the flint stones that were found, sharpened stones that were found next to them. And it is very particular butchering marks that people would still use today. Like that's just how you get meat off of a bone with a knife or an axe,
Mhm.
right? So it's very, very, very clear. And I mean, we're cooking this stuff for, I mean, hundreds of thousands of years at least. And
Mhm.
so um, it's 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 very clear in that. And so the people saying that no, humans were herbivores, it's just made up. It's just completely made up. And during the ice ages, especially the northern areas, they
Mhm.
didn't even have access to fruit or vegetables. I mean, there's nothing about. There's pine trees,
Yeah.
and they're 6 feet under the snow. There was some grass maybe, and that's what the mammoths would sort of dig up and get after. But
And we couldn't
you know,
we couldn't have we couldn't have survived, right? I mean,
Oh,
like if it not
yeah.
only was there not enough vegetation for us on a regular basis, but let's talk for a minute about the nutrients. So many people will say,
Mhm.
"Oh, I get my iron from spinach." The amount of spinach that you would
No,
have to
no.
right. And vegans and vegetarians today, specifically vegans, because vegetarians a lot of times do eat some dairy and some eggs, but vegans specifically do have to supplement. Plant-based people do have to supplement to be able to get all of their nutrients. So let's talk for a minute the difference between getting the iron from spinach and getting the iron from red meat, which is the most nutritious food on the planet.
Well, I mean, that's the whole point, right? I mean, how can we be herbivores if we have to take supplements when you eat plants, right?
Right.
It doesn't work, you know. The only thing that could possibly be our natural diet is something that we would be able to get all of our requisite nutrients from and not have to take supplements. Koalas don't actually have to take supplements. And people say, well, the only B12 you're getting from the beef is already injected into the cow. It's like, well, it's not. Well, they just get it from their food. And if you're in an intensive feedlot and they're not eating what they're supposed to eat either, then sure, maybe they need that sort of stuff. But if they're eating what they're supposed to eat, then no, that's not how
Mhm.
that's how the food chain works. And
Yeah.
so you break up that food chain, yeah, there's a problem. But no, it's plenty of B12 in meat when they're just eating what they're supposed to eat and what we're supposed to eat. And so as far as the iron is concerned, there's this idea of bioavailability. So, going back to, plants' defenses, plants will defend themselves in a number of different ways. One is by being directly toxic and poisonous or disrupting our hormones or having some sort of chemical agent go into our body and disrupt our physiological processes or even kill us. And another one is by just not being as nutritious, by binding up their nutrients in complex chemical bonds that, other animals, most animals don't have the enzymes to break down. And so there's this idea of bioavailability that there may be iron in there, but it's not actually accessible. There was actually a study in spinach with calcium because there's a lot of calcium in there. So you put this through mass spectrometry and you see, ooh, iron, calcium, all that stuff. Great, that's fine. But what does that actually do for us? Calcium is bound up in ways that we can't access, and there are oxalates and some very high oxalates in spinach that are anti-nutrients. That's another way that plants defend themselves is by making phytic acid, oxalates, tannins, other sorts of things that will bind on and denature proteins and nutrients so that we can't absorb them or actually get into our bloodstream and actually strip them out of our bloodstream. So they gave people spinach in order to boost their calcium levels. And in fact, their calcium levels went down because the
Mm.
calcium wasn't bioavailable and the oxalates went in their body and actually took away the oxalates in their body. So it's much more complicated than just what's in there. And the same thing goes for iron because these same anti-nutrients can chelate out the iron, they can block you from absorbing iron, can actually pull out iron in your body as well. And the bioavailability of iron in spinach is one third the heme iron in meat, which is it's funny, but it's also one of the other excuses and detractions that the vegans have about eating. You don't want to eat meat because there's just so much iron. You just get iron overload, and it's like, oh, okay, so bioavailable nutrients are bad now.
Right.
You want things that you can't access. Apparently, it's very strange. No
Mhm.
animal eats things. The least bioavailable food they eat. The things that they eat, they've adapted to. Well, the thing that you've eaten the longest, whatever your species is, that's what you've adapted to. You've had the longest to adapt to, and you're going to be most benefited by. Nothing needs to adapt to meat, though. Herbivores can all eat meat. They all benefit from meat. And in fact, herbivores will opportunistically eat smaller animals all the time.
Mm.
And 70% of animal species are carnivores. And so they're just eating other animals all the time as well. So there's nothing inherently bad in meat. I mean, some things have poison sacs or poison skin. Some frogs will eat some poisonous plants and that will make their skin poisonous. And someone tried to throw that at, oh, well, what about this? Hey, it's eating a plant. The plant is the poison, right? So you're
Mhm.
kind of proving my point. But some things use poison sacs and venom and things like that. But the meat itself, that's to protect the meat. The meat doesn't have to be poisonous. The meat doesn't have to be toxic because they have other defenses. And so when you get to the meat, that's the most bioavailable and nutritious source of food on earth. So for all animals. And so, all herbivores can eat and do very well on meat. And in fact, they use that, bone meal and things like that in feed for livestock. The off sort of bits and spinal columns and things like that from cows that don't get used in food or glue or what get ground up, put in pet food, or put back into the feed for the next round of cows because it's very nutritious. There's a lot of really good nutrients in there. So you don't actually have to have a special adaptation to eat meat. You do have to have special adaptation to eat plants because low bioavailability, anti-nutrients, straight up toxins. You need to be able to adapt to those sorts of problems. And so we're not. We've had some populations like European populations and other populations that have had access to exposure, I should say, to agriculture for longer periods, 8 to 10,000 years, have had at least 8 to 10, that period of time to adapt to agriculture. But Native Americans, Native Canadians, Native Australians have not. The Maasai have not, and they do much worse, and so they get much more affected and afflicted by these plant toxins, and they have much higher rates of chronic disease, of the diseases of civilization, or these non-communicable chronic diseases. But just look at the diabetes rates of Native Americans, far higher than the rest of Americans, the rest of the population of Americans, and the chronic disease rates are much higher. And people can say, well, there's that higher alcoholism and this, that, and the other. And that's probably true, but maybe it's not, and the thing is that these diseases started presenting themselves immediately after that. And after they sort of picked out the bison and they started having to eat agricultural crops, that's when these diseases started to set in. They were drinking alcohol when they were eating bison too. Why did they have these rates of chronic disease? So there's always an excuse for everything, but it happens again and again and again and again with every single population you see do this. So it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. So with all of the low fat, high carb nutrition information, which is like the worst failed science experiment in the history of America, I believe. We give grains to cows to fatten them up, right? We give grains to livestock to help fatten them up. And that's what's happening in America. And so, and there's never been as many illnesses, as many sick people as we have right now. There's never been as many overweight people as we have right now. And there's never been as many people that don't have good mental health too. So let's talk about that, about how important the fat is for our brains. We've been scared off by Ansel Keys, and we can talk about him again. We can talk about him in a little while, but the idea that we don't need fat, that we shouldn't eat fat, and that we don't need it is just crazy because our brains need the fat, right?
Our brains are fat.
Yeah.
So I think 60% of our brain is fat, and a lot of that fat is DHA or EPA, which are these animal omega-3 fatty acids. You can't get these from plants. Or a lot of the plant versions of things are just not nearly as good to us, or just completely useless. So, you need omega-3s, but which omega-3s do you need? You need DHA and EPA. You don't just need random omega-3s. The plant version is ALA, alpha linoleic acid. That doesn't do anything for our brain, and there's at most a 5% conversion from ALA to DHA or EPA. And in fact, I've seen studies that are very different than that. That show that people that consume a high amount of ALA actually drop their DHA. So I don't think that that's at all in any way proven that this converts at all or is beneficial at all to our DHA and EPA. And then the omega-6s, we need some omega-6s, but what we need is arachidonic acid. We don't need linoleic acid, which is the plant version of that, which can turn into arachidonic acid. But the linoleic acid can do a lot of other things that aren't so great in our bodies, and especially our brains, before they turn into arachidonic acid. Or if you have an abundance of this stuff, there is an abundance of linoleic acid in plant oils, then you're not converting this stuff necessarily to arachidonic acid, and you're having it break down and cause inflammation and damage. Your brain is largely made out of cholesterol as well. A large portion of the cholesterol in your body is in your brain. Your brain makes cholesterol. It's very important. It's vital for your brain to have cholesterol. There are countless studies showing that disruption in cholesterol metabolism will cause serious deleterious effects and developmental issues or cognitive issues in adults, and certainly developmental issues in children. And now we're trying to expressly cause metabolic dysfunction of our cholesterol. We're taking medications across the blood-brain barrier and stop our body from producing cholesterol, which would be the statins. That causes a direct imbalance in our cholesterol metabolism in our brain. We have endless studies showing that that's a bad idea and causes dysfunction in the brain and development of the brain. And we're trying to do this. That doesn't make any sense to me. And then, like you said, your brain is made out of fat. Your nervous system is made out of fat. We need fat. We've always eaten fat. Fat is what makes the animal kingdom go around for carnivores and herbivores. I mean, you look at carnivores, again, 70% of animal species are carnivores, and they typically go for animals that have fat, and they go for the fat first. That's why they go after the belly. I mean, that's bacon, is belly fat, right? Is the belly, right? So that the lions eat that first. That's where all the fattiest tissue is. And they get into the abdomen. That's where most of the fat is deposited. You have the omentum, which is just a bunch of fat. The mesentery around the vessels of the intestines is completely covered in fat. And you may have more intra-abdominal fat as well. So there's a lot of fat in there. So that's why they would go for the abdomen first. Yes, they are very, very nutrient dense organs, but that's where the fat is. And so you have these animals that are getting a large portion of their calories from fat. They're lean, strong, healthy, don't get heart disease. And then you have herbivores that most of them eat fibrous plants. But no animal can break down cellulose. Right? They don't make cellulase. It's the microorganisms in their gut. Even termites don't make cellulase. They have protozoa in their gut that do that. And so in cows, they have bacteria. The bacteria will eat the cellulose, and as a byproduct of the cellulose metabolism, they produce saturated fat. And so they absorb the saturated fat, and then bacteria die off, and they absorb that as protein. So when you look at this, you're looking, oh, look at how much protein's in there. That's not what they look at. It's bacterial, or it's a bacterial origin protein that they're getting in. So you can get very low protein plants, but they actually absorb a lot of fat and protein. So they're eating leaves, they're eating grass, but what they're absorbing is fat and protein, generally 70 to 80% calories from fat, 1 to 2 grams of saturated fat, 1 gram of protein. And so all animals run with fat, predominantly. I mean, hummingbirds and bumblebees and things like that, honeybees, like who knows what their metabolism looks like. I have no idea, eating sugar and nectar and things like that. But animals, the vast majority of animals are either carnivores eating animals that are made out of fat and protein, or herbivores that eat fibrous plants that convert that fiber into fat and protein. So this is just the stuff of life. And why would we be the only animal species on Earth to get sick from our natural biological diet, to start getting sick from that diet in the last 100 years when it's never made us sick before, and to get sick from eating fat when no other animal gets sick from eating fat? They all thrive from eating natural animal fats. Now, all animals will get sick from eating fake plant oils. That's true. Nutritional sciences in animals and livestock is far more robust than humans, because you actually take 5,000 cattle and do X, and then 5,000 cattle and do Y, and see what the difference is, and say, okay, how do we increase the poundage? How do we increase the health? How do we do this? Because animals are worth something, and so they want to make sure that they're healthy and that they're on weight and all these sorts of things, because that makes people more money. Humans are essentially worthless, except when we're sick. And so if we're healthy and we're just going about our business, no one's making money on us. But when we get sick and damaged, then we have to go and find help and pay for it, right? So, but animals, they're worth more healthy, and so healthy and alive, and so they've actually we get far more serious data and science out of animal nutrition than human nutrition. And human, 11 the food companies, processed food companies, that's just part of their marketing budget. They spend 11 times the amount of money on nutritional research than the National Institutes of Health, right? The NIH. So it is crazy. And so it's all marketing and propaganda. They're just pushing their product. And so all this stuff supports the processed food, plant-based diet and vilifies meat incorrectly. But in animal nutrition, they what you do has to work or else you lose money, right? And so, I mean, they tried giving kale to sheep, and it gave them goiters, which is a enlarged thyroid, so thyroid dysfunction. And they had these stillbirths and these deep, gross deformities, and then these stillborn babies, baby lambs were being born with goiters the size of their head. Then they were like, okay, well, that doesn't work. So then they gave kale to dairy cows, and because they need a lot of feed to produce all that milk. They produced a lot of milk, and then the milk was actually causing goiters in humans, right? And so then they said, oh, okay, well, this seems to cause, there's a whole class of plant toxins called goitrogens, things that cause goiters and destroy the functionality of your thyroid. And so it said, okay, well, this causes goiters and kills lambs. This causes goiters in people that drink the milk from this. All right, we'll just give it to people then. Just sell it to those idiots and see what happens. Like what do you think is going to happen? Because humans are essentially worthless. No one cares. They just people getting sick. They're doing these things. They're having thyroid dysfunction, but no one actually puts two and two together because it doesn't benefit anybody financially and monetarily to figure that out. And they did this with vegetable oils as well. These industrial seed oil. I mean, you horrify yourself. Just go on YouTube and look up how they make, how they make seed oils and canola oil and things like that. It's a horrific, it's a horrific industrial process with insane chemicals that are known carcinogens and toxins. And so, and just the seeds themselves are toxic. They use this with rapeseed oil, which was so toxic. They said, no, absolutely not. You can't use that. That's why canola oil is sort of an engineered, slightly less toxic version of rapeseed oil. It's still toxic. It's just not so toxic that they made it illegal like they did rapeseed oil. And so when they gave this to livestock, they thought, okay, well, would this help bring up the poundage of these animals? They found, yeah, it did. Yeah, they did gain weight. They did put on fat, and they all started dying of heart attacks. And it was like, why is a cow getting a heart attack? Why are humans getting a heart attack? Why is anything getting a heart attack? That is a very abnormal thing.
Yeah.
The natural state of all life on Earth is that of health, and yet we're accepting that as normal to be dying of these horrible chronic diseases and being sick for decades. And this it's not compatible with life in the wild. It would never happen. And so obviously there's something going on. But yeah, it's when you look at, I mean, you feed these animals and you see how sick they get, what they get sick with when they eat the wrong diet, and you start looking at the similarities between that and the illnesses that humans get, it starts making a bit more sense. And one of the things that that I saw as well is the malnutrition side of things. You're not eating the right things, so you're not getting enough nutrients. And one thing that we stripped out of the soil is selenium. And so we just growing crops and crops and crops and just stripping selenium out of the soil. And so sometimes that's not in the grass for cows. And they found that cows get muscular dystrophy, and it's the exact same muscular dystrophy that humans get. But they figured it out because this is costing people money. So, okay, what the hell is going on? They figured out it was a selenium deficiency. And so you just supplement selenium, it goes away. That's why you have, mineral licks and things like that for the cows and as they're growing up, so they don't get it in the first place. Has anyone ever asked if human muscular dystrophy is a selenium deficiency or any other sort of deficiency? I've sort of raised this a few times, and no one's ever said like, oh yeah, never thought of that. And I mentioned to a neurologist friend of mine, and he just went, yeah, I never looked for that, but I will, because he treats muscular dystrophy. And so he's like, yeah, next patient I see with muscular dystrophy, I'll check him for selenium and other sorts of things. I would be very interested. At the very least, it's worth asking that question.
Yeah.
And so, we need to take in all aspects of information and data here. And looking at the animal world, of which we are a part of, is a very good way of doing that.
So speaking of people getting sick, I've been a carnivore for a little over 3 years. You've been a carnivore a lot longer than that. Why don't we have scurvy and gout?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think that's a question that maybe the vegans can answer, and they'll make something up. Yeah, it's because that scurvy and gout aren't caused by that. Gout is not caused by eating meat. That was actually the cure for gout in the 1800s was a red meat only diet from Dr. J. Salisbury, whom the Salisbury steak was named after. And so when when the cure for gout for 150 years is red meat, it's a pretty cheeky claim that red meat causes gout.
That's right.
Right? It's strictly against the observed evidence. And vitamin C and scurvy. I mean, it's funny when you look back at the history of scurvy. It was from the British, and they said, "Oh, we're not getting enough vitamin C," and so you're getting scurvy. But who was getting, and so they had Lyme. So they brought Lymes on board, and they say, okay, they're called Limeys as a result of that. But Limeys were pejorative. I mean, they were saying that as a negative. And so why were the British called Limeys if everyone knew that limes were really important to stave off scurvy? Because no one else was getting scurvy. The Spanish and the Portuguese and the French and the other seafaring nations of Europe were not getting, Norway. I mean, Leif Erikson made it to North America. They didn't bring limes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Chris Columbus, he came to America as well. They weren't packing limes as well, as far as I know. And so it was actually just the British, but it was also the British sailors. It wasn't the British officers. So on the same ship, you'd have British sailors getting scurvy, but the British officers not getting scurvy. Why is that? Because the sailors were being fed a bunch of gruel and whatever thin oatmeal sort of stuff, and the officers got meat. So they didn't get scurvy. So and the other sailors and other nations were eating meat, and they weren't getting scurvy either. If scurvy is a misdevelopment of collagen, so you have improperly bound collagen. It's not very strong and tight, and so it breaks down very easily. And your tissue starts breaking down, your vessels start breaking down, you start getting aortic dissections and all these sorts of things, and you die. It's very serious, and that's because you have chunky collagen, and it's not good. It's not healthy. It's not compatible with life, and that doesn't happen if you eat meat because there's already collagen in it. And you get the precursors for collagen. What vitamin C does is it catalyzes a reaction that hydrolyzes the amino acids proline and lysine, so you get this strong, proper bond for collagen. And without that, then you can't hydrolyze that. However, if you are, or actually do hydrolyze, it catalyzes the reaction. It doesn't cause the reaction, but it vastly speeds it up. But if you're eating meat, you already get the pre-hydrolyzed proline and lysine already. So you don't actually need vitamin C to make collagen. You could make all the collagen that you need because you're eating collagen. And so it's only when you're not eating enough meat and you're not getting enough of those precursors for collagen that you would need vitamin C so that you can make it de novo. Without that, you don't need it. Also, when you're eating carbohydrate, they both get taken up in the gut by the GLUT4 transporter. And so if you're eating carbohydrates, it competes for binding sites with the vitamin C. And so you just take up far less vitamin C. And so if you're eating carbohydrates, then you need vitamin C measured in milligrams. And that's to stave off scurvy. That's without eating enough meat. But if you're not eating carbohydrates, then you need vitamin C measured in nanograms, which is 1/1,000,000th of a milligram. So it's a very different story just eating meat, especially when you're not eating carbs. But just look at the Maasai. They eat meat, but they also drink milk, and there's a lot of carbs in milk. They don't get scurvy either. There is a bit of vitamin C in meat. There's more in liver. There's actually more vitamin C per gram of liver than there is per gram of an apple, right? And so, but the Maasai, even though they're, you know, eating a lot of carbs in the form of milk, that's predominant part of their diet is milk, a lot of carbs there. So they're probably absorbing very little of the vitamin C in the meat and the blood, but they're still not getting scurvy because they're eating meat and blood and milk, and they're getting the precursors for collagen in the first place, so they don't need it. So it's just a very different story. When you're eating your proper diet, things just actually work, and that's kind of how you know it's your proper diet.
So I already know the answer to this because we have talked about this before, but for people who are wondering, grass-fed or conventional meat, which is better?
Well, it depends on what you're looking what your metric is, but but objectively, grass-fed and finished beef will have more micronutrients. I've seen different ranchers publish that their the nutritional contents of their grass-fed finished or generally raised beef, and they typically have 4 to 5 times the number of micronutrients. They'll have a different constellation of fatty acids, so they'll have more of the DHA, better ratio with the arachidonic acid. They'll have less linoleic acid. So if they're eating a whole bunch of corn and soy and wheat and things like grains, then they'll have higher linoleic acid and they'll have less DHA and EPA and things like that. So there are objective differences. We don't have robust studies looking at the sort of the health outcomes of this, and certainly not in carnivore populations. But of the studies that we have, which are very preliminary, they don't see any clear marked difference in health outcome between grass fed and just grain finished. So the take home is that grass fed is objectively better. It objectively has more nutrients, vitamins, and minerals, and a better constellation of fatty acids, and a better ratio of those fatty acids as well. But grain finished beef is fantastic, and I sort of think of it as like the gold and silver at the Olympics. Silver lost a gold, and that's sad, but silver also beat everybody else on earth, and so that's great. So you don't have to break the bank. You don't have to just do this as we only eat grass-fed fish. Well, if you can, then that's great.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't have access to that, or you can't afford that, and grain finish is absolutely fantastic. I mean, I've spent the last 5-6 years just eating Costco ribeyes. I mean, that's just all I've been eating. And now I've found a place, because they sponsor my show, I order direct from a grass-fed and finished pasture-raised sort of farm here in Australia, Stockman steak. So now I get more access to that grass-fed stuff, and the grass-fed fat, which is great. So getting those fat trimmings, they're all like dark yellow, fantastic. It tastes great, but also has a great nutrition profile. When I look at my patients and I check their blood results, typically when people are just eating whatever meat that they want to eat, their vitamins, minerals, hormones, they all improve dramatically. Some of the time, when people are on grain finished, eating just normal store-bought meat, their B12 and other nutrients will get up into really good levels, much better than everybody else. They're not quite optimal. The people that are really diligent about eating grass-fed and finished meat, always in that optimal range. And so I do see a slight difference there. But at the same time, those people that aren't quite optimal with grain finished, add in a bit of liver 3 times a week, done. So, if you're worried about that nutritional density loss from grass fed to grain finished, then just add in a bit of organs, which are much more nutrient dense. You can often find grass fed liver, and that'll have a great nutrition profile. Generally cheap as dirt because no one wants liver.
Yeah.
And so you can get that. The less you cook it, the better it tastes. I actually prefer raw liver. I cut up a liver the other day, and I was just sort of looking at it. I'm like, I don't know, that just looks good to me. I'm like, okay, yeah, that's delicious. I ate like a third of this liver
Interesting.
just raw. I thought it was great. I fried it up a bit and just seared the outsides. And I was like, man, it's better raw. It was fine. It was better than cooked well done because it was raw in the middle, so it still had that nice flavor. But there's just cooked liver is not nearly as good as raw liver. So that's an easy way of filling in those gaps. And so if you only have access to grain finished, or even if you prefer grain finished, some people prefer the flavor and the fat content, obviously, then you can add in a bit of liver if you're not quite optimal. Use nutrients. Real easy. Yeah. And for fat, you get grass-fed fat trimmings if you can, and grass-fed butter. Grass-fed butter has a great omega-3 to 6 profile.
Awesome. Dr. Chafee, thank you so much for visiting with me today and for answering my questions. Hopefully we can help some people.
Yeah, definitely. I hope it does.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you so much for watching. Be safe, be well, and I'll see you next time.